How exactly does a civil conflict in a relatively isolated, landlocked buffer state manage to bring down an entire era of global peace? Seriously, how does a seemingly straightforward military intervention snowball into a decade of ruin that claims over 1 million lives? Well, welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most pivotal and frankly devastating conflicts of the 20th century. Today, we're diving into the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, this is a topic that absolutely reshaped the Cold War landscape. We're going to break down the entire complex web of political shuffling, the massive religious backlash, and the sheer superpower paranoia that turned Afghanistan into a global battleground. We'll stick to the facts, straight from the historical record, to figure out exactly how and why this whole thing happened. Okay, let's dive right into our agenda for today. We'll be covering 1. The 1978 Kabul Revolution, 2. The rise of resistance, 3. Moscow's strategic calculation, 4. The 1979 invasion itself, 5. The death of détente, and finally, number 6, 10 years of ruin. So, starting us off with Section 1, the 1978 Kabul Revolution. To really understand this invasion, we first have to wrap our heads around the chaotic political shuffling that literally started the whole domino effect. Right, so it all kicks off in April 1978. A communist party, the PDPA, overthrows the Afghan government. But, you see, their new communist-style reforms completely alienate the country's traditional elite. Fast forward to the spring of 1979, and a fierce civil war has already broken out. And amidst all this chaos, it becomes a literal backstabbing contest in the capital. By September, the head of the army, a guy named Hafizullah Amin, actually seizes power. And then by October, the former president is assassinated. This leaves Amin in charge of a highly unstable, deeply fractured country. Moving right into Section 2, the rise of resistance. Amin pushed his controversial policies forward, but they sparked a massive organized uprising. To understand this resistance, we really need to define the type of warfare they were using. These fighters against the government were guerrillas. Now, a guerrilla is basically an irregular fighter who takes part in an unofficial war or conflict against regular state-sponsored military forces. They aren't wearing traditional uniforms. They aren't fighting in standard formations. Instead, they rely heavily on mobility, deep knowledge of the terrain, and the element of surprise. And, this made them an absolute nightmare for a traditional, slow-moving army to fight. So the crucial point here is that in Afghanistan, thousands of Afghan Muslims joined forces to form a very specific guerrilla movement known as the Mujahideen. These were Muslim guerrilla fighters who banded together with one main goal: to violently oppose Hafizullah Amin's government and eventually the Soviet forces. Now, the Mujahideen view their struggle as way more than just a political revolution. They proclaimed to be on a holy mission for Allah. In fact, they officially declared a jihad on the supporters of Amin. A jihad, at least in the specific context, is a holy war or a spiritual mission declared by Muslims against perceived enemies of their faith. This religious framing was incredibly powerful. It actually served to unite a bunch of different fractured factions across the country against the communist government. On to Section 3, Moscow's strategic calculation. Because while Afghanistan was burning, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev was watching very closely from Moscow. Let's look at the layers of absolute paranoia driving Moscow at this point. First off, Brezhnev was terrified, and I mean terrified, of Islamic fundamentalism spreading to the USSR's 30 million Muslim citizens. Adding to that panic, the Soviet secret police were reporting wild rumors that Amin was actually an American spy. I know, it sounds crazy, but since he was trying to improve links with the USA, they fully believed it. Brezhnev essentially thought he was being completely surrounded, and he fatally miscalculated that America would simply ignore a Soviet invasion just to avoid a larger war. But to the Soviet public, this wasn't pitched as aggression at all. It was defense. Take a look at this quote from journalist Alexander Bovin, writing in the Soviet newspaper Izvestia back in 1980. He claims that failing to intervene would pave the way for massive U.S. presence in a country that borders on the Soviet Union, and that non-intervention would be a disgrace and a betrayal. So to the public, this whole thing was sold as a heavy but entirely necessary burden for national security. Let's get into Section 4, the 1979 invasion. Let's see exactly how all this paranoia built into a direct catastrophe. On December 24, 1979, over 50,000 Soviet troops just poured into the country. The official Soviet story? Well, they claimed they were invited by President Amin to help support his government against terrorists under a previously signed treaty. But the reality? Just 3 days later, Amin was assassinated by Soviet commandos. Some invitation, right? Moscow then immediately installed a puppet leader, an exiled Afghan communist named Babrak Karmal. And Karmal now depended entirely on Soviet military support just to stay in power. Which brings us to Section 5, the death of détente. The invasion was complete, and the global fallout was both instantaneous and severe. Before we look at the world's reaction, we need to understand what was actually lost here. The 1970s had really been defined by détente, which is the easing of hostility or strained relations, specifically between the USA and the Soviet Union. Now, while some historians argue détente was already starting to fracture, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan completely shattered it. Superpower cooperation was officially over. Done. And listen to this incredible disconnect. On the hotline with U.S. President Jimmy Carter on December 28th, literally a day after Amin was killed, Brezhnev tries to downplay the whole thing. He actually tells Carter they have been invited in by the government to protect it from an outside threat and that they will remove forces as soon as the situation stabilizes. But the rest of the world? They weren't buying it for a second. Look at the reaction from the Chinese newspaper, the Beijing People's Daily, just a few days later. They view the invasion not as some temporary stabilization mission, but as a dangerous stepping stone for a southward thrust towards Pakistan and India. Global alarm bells were ringing loudly, and everyone was on edge. Now, U.S. President Jimmy Carter didn't send American troops, but he hit back hard where it hurt. He immediately imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union. Economic sanctions, by the way, are commercial and financial penalties applied by one or more countries against a targeted nation to force a change in their policy. But alongside these economic penalties, Carter also began a covert operation, secretly sending weapons and eventually billions of dollars in funds to the Afghan Mujahideen. And this is a perfect example of how a conflict happening thousands of miles away can completely upend domestic politics at home. The invasion made President Carter look weak to the American public. So, in the 1980 U.S. presidential election, Republican candidate Ronald Reagan used this exact crisis to argue that America needed to aggressively stand up to communism. Reagan ends up winning a massive landslide victory, pretty much guaranteeing confrontational U.S.-Soviet relations for the foreseeable future. Finally, Section 6, 10 Years of Ruin. What was intended as a swift intervention turned into an absolute disaster. For the Soviet Union, this conflict became a massive bleeding wound. Because Afghan soldiers were constantly deserting to join the Mujahideen, the Soviet Union eventually had to deploy 85,000 soldiers just to keep the Karmal government from collapsing. The financial cost of this drawn-out occupation, it was staggering. We're talking approximately $8 billion every single year. It literally bled the Soviet economy dry until they finally, mercifully withdrew in 1989. But as horrific as that financial cost was, it pales in comparison to the human cost. Fighting against a fiercely motivated Mujahideen that was now heavily equipped with American weapons, the Soviet military suffered deeply. Over those 10 long years, almost 15,000 Russian soldiers were killed in a foreign land. The most tragic statistic of all, however, belongs to the people of Afghanistan. When you strip away all the Cold War politics, the ideology, the superpower rivalries, the civilian casualties of this conflict were nearly unimaginable. To put it into perspective, estimates suggest that as many as 1.5 million Afghan civilians died during this devastating decade. It leaves us with this final, lingering thought. When a superpower lets paranoia and poor intelligence drive them into a foreign civil war, the consequences ripple across the globe and through generations. How does a nation, or even a global system, ever truly recover when a quote-unquote swift intervention turns into a decade of disastrous ruin? It's a question that defined the end of the Cold War, and honestly, one that remains powerfully relevant today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped piece together the massive impact of the 1979 invasion. Keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.